Okay, it is the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome to today's webinar, The Poetry of Pediatrics, Health Humanities in Practice. My name is April Wright, and I am the Outreach Librarian with Region 1 of the Network of the National Library of Medicine, the NNLM. Our guest presenter today is Dr. Irene Mathieu. Before I turn things over to Dr. Mathieu, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on the NNLM YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. We're happy to offer MLACEs and chess credit for this class, and the evaluation link will be shared at the end. Dr. Mathieu will answer questions at the end, so please put your questions and comments in the chat, and be sure to send it to everyone. Now a bit about who we are. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, is the nation's leading medical research agency. The NLM, National Library of Medicine, is one of 27 institutes and offices of the National Institutes of Health. It is the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources like PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM is the network of the National Library of Medicine and is the outreach program of the NLM, working to ensure health professionals and the public have equal access to health information. If you'd like more information about us, or to find your regional medical library, you can check out our website at nnlm.gov. The NNLM is made up of 7 geographic regions. We are in Region 1, which is based at the University of Maryland, Baltimore Health Sciences and Human Services Library, and serves these states. The NNLM provides funding for health and outreach projects, free webinars and classes, and access to a network of public and academic libraries, community and faith-based organizations, and universities. NNLM Discovery is a new podcast launched by NNLM. Podcasts are available wherever you get your podcasts or on nnlm.gov/podcast. Now, please join me in welcoming our guest presenter, Irene Mathieu. Dr. Mathieu is a pediatrician, author of 3 award-winning poetry collections, assistant professor of pediatrics at University of Virginia, and is the Assistant Director of Health Humanities at the University of Virginia Center for Health Humanities and Ethics. She uses poetry to teach pediatric residents about health equity. Dr. Mathieu is interested in medical and resident education around socioeconomic factors that influence the health of individuals and communities, advocacy, training, and community-engaged health equity research and programming. Her public health interests include environmental child health, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience in both global and local communities. Dr. Mathieu believes that engagement with the local community is critical to being a good neighbor and providing excellent care. Welcome, Dr. Mathieu. And let me stop sharing.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thanks to everyone who is on today for my presentation. So I'll go ahead and jump right in, and hopefully you can all see that. I want to give a shout out. The title of my presentation, "And So to Tenderness I Add My Action," is a line from a poem by Aracelis Girmay, who's one of my favorite contemporary poets. So usually at the beginning of these presentations, we have disclosures, and the only disclosure I want to make today that I have is that I am not only a physician, as you heard, but I'm also a writer and primarily a poet. And this interest and this love for these 2 fields grew very early. I come from a family of people who are very involved in medicine, and I also come from a family of readers and writers and lovers of the humanities and the written word. Here you can see a picture of me with a horse around my neck when I was probably about 6 or 7, with my mom and my 2 younger siblings and my grandmother all crowded around a book. And I love this picture because it really illustrates the centrality of the written word in my childhood from a very early age. I was always writing and thinking and immersing myself in stories. So to me, poetry and medicine are two natural compatriots and not two distinct genres or pursuits, which I know may be counterintuitive, especially for this audience. My partner is not a librarian, but he did recently rearrange all books in our home by the Library of Congress classification system. And I learned that the classification systems that libraries use are very genre specific. And so they really kind of break things down into these particular categories. And I'm here to sort of disrupt that a little bit for you all and challenge you to see the kind of permeability among these categories and how it might help us push health forward for all. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about what narrative medicine is, what it can do based on the evidence that we have, and to help you understand how literature can be used to teach specifically about structural inequities and health disparities. Then I want to talk specifically about poetry as a narrative medicine tool, which I know can be intimidating for folks who are not kind of in that world of poetry. And I want us to practice a little bit as a group, looking at some of my favorite poems that I often teach. So the idea that storytelling and narrative are an important part of medicine is not new, but in the past few years, it has been getting increased attention. This is an article from the New Yorker where hematologist-oncologist Jerome Groopman argued that part of being an adept physician is being an adept storyteller. And he was quoting Oliver Sacks, who is one of kind of the fathers of Western biomedicine. So this is a very old concept. However, we know that in recent years, and really since the Flexner report, which was this big kind of groundbreaking report in 1910 that created a set of recommendations to restructure medical education. And Abraham Flexner, who wrote this report, was sort of coming to terms with the fact that there were more medical discoveries being made. We were kind of moving into this empirical way of thinking about science and medicine and the human body, and away from kind of the earlier, if you think of like the humors and the ways we used to think about science and medicine. And the Flexner report really called for an overhaul of medical curricula. And the result of that we see today is that medical curriculum is filled with anatomy, biology, physiology, chemistry, all of what we consider these hard sciences. And people often peg this on the Flexner report. And it's true that Flexner did say the practitioner deals with facts of two categories. He pointed out that chemistry, physics, and biology were really important. But he goes on to say that people need an apperceptive and appreciative apparatus to deal with other more subtle elements that come up in medical practice. And he said that specific preparation in this direction is more difficult. One must rely for the requisite insight and sympathy on a varied and enlarging cultural experience. And I would argue that until the past 20 years or so, we in medical education have kind of lost that piece of the Flexner report and aren't so focused on the cultural experience that I think it does require to create not only good physicians, but good healthcare providers in general. And so I would argue that one piece of that approach could be using the power of language and narrative practices. Stories could be thought of as qualitative data. They can illustrate experiences and therefore generate emotional experiences in their readers or listeners in ways that quantitative data alone cannot. And they expand what I call our situational differential. So in medicine, we're taught to think about the differential diagnosis or the list of potential diagnoses that a patient might have. And I think that it's important as practitioners to also think about the social diagnosis, what's going on in that exam room or what's going on in that patient's life, not just medically, but socially. And I think that having a large exposure to stories and a broad and diverse exposure to stories allows us to expand our differential diagnosis when it comes to this other set of issues. And I further will argue the study of stories can lead us to educational outcomes that are really important in health equity education. I'll talk more about these in a moment, but these are structural competency and critical consciousness. So you could think of health humanities broadly as basically any time we're using the humanities, so art, history, philosophy, ethics, religious studies, literature, anything that we would consider humanities, to teach health education. And narrative medicine in particular is a sort of subcategory that's focused on the written word. And it's defined as the close reading of literature and reflective writing. And so those two aspects, the reading and the writing, are what we call narrative practices. Rita Sharon, who's considered one of the godmothers or the grandmothers of narrative medicine, said that it's meant to build narrative competence, which is the ability to acknowledge, absorb, interpret, and act on the stories and plights of others. and it impacts relational areas between the physician, although you could also insert here nurse, physician assistant, many types of providers, and their self, and then their relationship with their patient, their colleagues, and their society as well. So I like to think about where narrative practices kind of fall in the chain of events. And if you think about the way that systems are created in which health happens and we see our patients, they start really with language. And so language forms our thoughts shape our behaviors, and our behaviors collectively create and maintain systems, which we know have a lot of problems in today's society and need to be reimagined and rebuilt. And so I would say that narrative practices sort of insert themselves at the point where language becomes thoughts, and they allow us to become more intentional and more aware of the automaticity of our thought processes, and that will have downstream effects on our behaviors and ultimately on our systems. Maya Angelou said, "Words are things." And I love that quote because she really meant they're literally physical objects. And what I take that to mean is that words really can have a material impact on the world because of how stories can actually change our behavior and therefore shape outcomes. So this is the cognitive behavioral triangle here in your right-hand corner, and it's used often in psychotherapy for patients who are dealing with depression and anxiety and a variety of other issues. And therapists will often point out how our thoughts, emotions, and behavior all play off one another and kind of create this positive feedback loop, if you will, of the triangle. And so I would say that narrative practices are a way that we can intervene in that loop. So just for a few examples, if you think about the phrasing of the things on the left column and imagine if we change it to things on the right, think about just the affective or emotional experience of saying, instead of "what's wrong with you," to "what happened to you," which is of course the language that we are encouraging folks to use with trauma-informed care, understanding that pathology is often a result of something that someone has been through, some trauma. Instead of saying "that mom is crazy," what if we were to say "that mom is scared"? Or instead of calling people illegal aliens, what if we use language like "undocumented person"? Or even the language of self-compassion. So instead of saying "I keep messing up," how does it feel to say "I'm still learning"? So these are just examples of how just the way that we phrase things, a simple change of a turn of phrase can really have an emotional impact that can actually change our thoughts and behaviors. So you may be wondering, what's the evidence for narrative medicine? What does this stuff actually do? And there is a decent amount of research so far on what narrative medicine can do. And this study by Kidd and Castano in 2013 found that reading literary fiction improves performance on a theory of mind task. And theory of mind is essentially a kind of empathy task. Another study found that med students' exposure to the humanities significantly correlated with a host of very positive attributes that I would say most of us probably want our physicians to have, like empathy, tolerance for ambiguity, wisdom, emotional appraisal, self-efficacy, even spatial skills. And this study also found an inverse relationship to some burnout symptoms. And these aren't just studies from the US. These studies have been done around the world. So a quasi-experimental narrative medicine program in Taiwan showed significant differences in an intervention group that received narrative medicine programming. And this intervention group showed increased reflective skepticism, empathetic reflection, critical open-mindedness, improved perceptions of patient-provider communication, and also empathy. Another study with med students in Iran showed similar results with reflection and empathy. And then a large review of narrative medicine programs, again, found that it improved doctor-patient communication, personal growth, and were largely well received by participants. This other very large review found that the vast majority of participants rated these programs positively. And you can see here this list of the competencies that you should start to see some repeated themes here with empathy and perspective taking, decrease in burnout, and confidence, etc. So narrative medicine programs do have a very significant impact. So now I'm going to pull in the health equity piece. And you may be thinking, okay, that's great, but what does this have to do with health equity and social determinants of health? And recently there have been calls for narrative medicine to do more than the empathy and decrease in burnout, which while these are very important, I think there's a lot more we can do with narrative medicine. And so these are just some examples of recent calls to expand the goals and objectives of narrative medicine beyond what we already have shown in the literature. And really, I love this article from Viney et al. Because they say that critical medical humanities, just kind of that next iteration of medical humanities, calls for a widening of the sights and scales of the medical. So thinking about medicine and health beyond just the clinical encounter, but as a larger set of issues that's happening in a society outside of hospitals and clinics. And they call for a robust commitment to new forms of interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration, which is a theme that hopefully you'll hear throughout this presentation. So coming back around to the two points that I said I would talk about earlier, structural competency is one outcome or objective I think we as narrative medicine practitioners can have. And I would challenge us to try to use literature and narrative to create and generate structural competency in our trainees. And so what is structural competency? It's really a sort of answer to cultural competency, which is the idea that, you know, we can sort of learn about how to take care of diverse patients by learning a little bit about their cultures, and then we'll be good. And that's obviously a very problematic and limited way of thinking about interacting with patients. And so then we kind of moved on to cultural humility, which is this notion that, well, we're not going to know everything about people's cultures, so maybe we should teach healthcare providers to be humble and to approach patients with humility, which, while important, still really places the onus of health disparities on culture and on individuals. And structural competency moves beyond that and says that we need to teach our trainees to discern how the things that we define as diseases or symptoms are not necessarily individual or cultural problems, but also represent the downstream implications of upstream decisions, such as healthcare, food delivery systems, zoning laws, infrastructure, even what we medicalize and how we define illness and health. And then separately, critical consciousness is an idea kind of coined by Paulo Freire, who is, of course, the renowned educator from Brazil. And Arno Kumagai and his colleagues really kind of utilize critical consciousness in a medical education context. And they say that we should use critical consciousness to reflect on power, privilege, and inequities embedded within social relationships, with an active commitment to social justice. So their argument is that if social determinants of health are human-made through these human-created systems, then we can also dismantle them through human efforts. And that part of our goal in medical education should be to train physicians to be critically conscious actors who can not only treat the patient in front of them, but also treat the larger society with an attention to the power imbalances that perpetuate the kind of social determinants of health and health disparities that result in disparate outcomes. So why poetry specifically? Of course, I am a poet, so I have a little bit of a bias, but I would argue that there are a lot of really amazing properties of poetry that make it an ideal medium for narrative medicine, and especially for these practices with respect to health equity. And I want to also kind of challenge those of you who may have an ambivalent relationship with poetry to throw out everything you heard in 11th grade English class that turned you off from poetry, because poems are probably a lot more varied than you may think they are. Poems are very weird, right? They're not written in language that we typically use to speak in a conversational way. And I love this phrase, again, from Kumagai et al., of making strange, which is the idea of using the arts to disrupt our automaticity of thinking. So going back to that little arrow slide I showed at the beginning of the way our language automatically turns into thoughts and behaviors, and to kind of challenge us to get outside of our comfort zones and our assumptions to discover new ways of perceiving and being in the world. Poetry is also not always linear. Of course, we tend to start at the beginning of a poem and read through to the end, but there are many ways in and out of a poem, or we like to say many doors into and out of a poem. And you don't necessarily have to start at the beginning or feel engaged at the beginning. There are a lot of ways to access a poem, and hopefully you'll see some examples of that soon. Poetry is very vulnerable, both in the sense that poets are often writing about things that are very difficult to say, that they may not feel comfortable writing about in prose, in an essay, or even in a fictionalized way. They may be talking about things that are so difficult to say that they actually can't find the language in prose, and poetry becomes the only way to really express or illustrate what they're trying to communicate. But they're also vulnerable in that they often make us as readers or listeners feel vulnerable, because poetry can feel very disorienting. And I think that vulnerability is important. I think it's important for physicians and other healthcare practitioners to occasionally feel a little bit destabilized and a little bit outside of our comfort zones, because that allows us to shift the power dynamic from one where the physician is in control and is kind of the authority, to one where the physician isn't quite sure and is reliant on the other person in the dynamic to help them make meaning of a situation. And so in that sense, they can shift power. They're very dynamic. The meaning of poems can change over time. One thing I really love is to read a poem and then a few years later come back to the same poem myself, a few years later, and realize there are new meanings in that poem for me because I've changed and my life has changed. Or similarly, to read my own poems to other people and then have people come up to me and say, I really love how you brought this up, or how you wrote about this symbol and this is what it means to me. And often I'm very shocked because I didn't necessarily know that was in my poem. And so I love that poems can have multiple ways of being read and understood. And they're often shorter. So just thinking practically, a lot of healthcare practitioners and researchers are incredibly busy and are not going to be necessarily reading Dostoevsky novels on their weekends. But because poems are shorter, they're a way for us to kind of have a literary experience in a shorter amount of time. So I call them multisensory microstories. They're a way that we can really have this intense emotional and narrative experience in a shorter time period. And so poems can really help us with what Kumagai recommends, which is reflecting on power, privilege, and inequities embedded within social relationships. So like I said, forget what you heard in 11th grade English class and take only these two rules forward in this presentation. So the two rules are that the I in a poem, so when a poet says, I did this, I did that, we never assume that that person is the poet. We call that the speaker. And while many poets do write about our own real life experiences, a poem is a way for us to sometimes fictionalize them or change specifics around so that we never assume that that's actually what the poet went through, but it's rather the speaker of the poem who's sort of an invented persona. Rule number 2 is that anything is possible. This comic strip is particularly relevant to me as a pediatrician and as a mother of a young child. I love how this person said, I wrote a poem today, and their partner says, really? And they say, well, I don't know if it's any good, but it felt good to do something creative for a change. Let's see. They say, write what you know. And the poem is called Diaper Funk. So I promise no subject is off limits in poetry. So how do we combine these two things? How do we kind of combine narrative medicine and health equity? And can we foster structural competency and cultural critical consciousness through a narrative medicine course? This was a question that my colleague, Dr. Ben Martin, and I asked ourselves when we created an undergraduate seminar here at the University of Virginia. And this was what we call a first-year undergrad seminar, which is generally for first and second year students. And our goals in this curriculum were to deepen the students' understanding of health disparities. Many of these students were interested in healthcare-related careers or public health, but were pretty new to the field. So we wanted them to understand what are social determinants of health. We wanted to help them hone close reading and writing skills and to practice critical and creative writing skills as well. And we really wanted to, from a literary standpoint, expand their approaches to scholarly analysis and help them engage them in some deep discussion about some of these topics. And the University Seminar Series is a competitive series where faculty from across the university are invited to submit proposals. And so Dr. Martin and I were selected to submit our class in 2021, and we called it Bodies and Books, Literature of Health Inequity. We organized each session thematically, and so we would pick a different social determinant of health for each class and then structure our readings and selections around those. We even invited a few guest speakers who came and talked about some of their personal experiences or their work, which was a really fun part of the class. And it was basically structured through critical literary analysis. So we would ask the students to read a selection of readings, and then we would come and discuss the readings in class and have in-class prompts as well as out-of-class prompts. Some of these prompts were creative in nature. We asked them to write poetry and short stories, and some of them were analytical in nature and really kind of your traditional analyze this poem or this story. I saw a question about how we actually got students to sign up. This was for undergraduate college students, and they're all required to take at least one university seminar. So they have a list of choices, and those who had an interest in literature and or social determinants of health elected to take the course. One drawback was that this was during kind of the height of the pandemic, and so it was all virtual. And I think that that does take away from discussion in a seminar type class, especially with first year students who are a bit shy and, you know, new to the college experience. But notwithstanding, they did a fantastic job and really enjoyed the class. So here are some examples of the class evaluations. You can see some of the comments the students offered. They really enjoyed the readings. They felt like their perspectives, there were multiple perspectives that they got to see, and as well as multiple writing styles. They enjoyed the selection of topics covered. We assigned not only readings, but also film and podcasts. So we really tried to expand how the students thought of narrative. We had them engage with different forms of literature. They enjoyed their creative assignments and their written assignments. And we really tried to make it flexible, both understanding that we were during a pandemic and things were going to happen in people's personal lives. But also we wanted to encourage and foment this kind of creativity and not put too many limitations on students. So many of our assignments were quite open-ended in nature. Just a few more student testimonials. One person said they learned to look at issues holistically and to recognize intersectionality and social and health related problems. Somebody else said that they are planning to be a nurse and they felt like this was a really important way for them to learn about social determinants of health, and that they will take away different ways of relating to and analyzing literature that they heard from their classmates as well as from Dr. Martin and myself. Okay, so now we're going to practice. So I'm going to ask for you all to participate a bit, and you will do that via the chat. So I'm going to share with you 3 poems that I often teach, and in some cases we'll be listening to recordings of the poet themselves reading the poem, and then I'll have a few questions, and I just like to generate a virtual discussion. I'll read off the comments as they come in. I do want to offer a little bit of content warning that these poems deal with some very heavy topics, such as slavery and emotional kind of distress with children. So I just want to kind of put that out there. And if you do feel like it's overwhelming, please feel free to take a pause. So this first poem is by the poet Sophia Sinclair, and we'll listen to her read it.
Notes on the State of Virginia 2. February, I am an open wound, woman discarded and woman emerging, scars devising scars. To live here, we know precisely how to be haunted. Sundown sun, a sterile sky come running, sweet gallow grass whistling, ghosts. All year we learn that chainsaw hymnal. Outside the lawn, another excavation. Slave quarters found concealed in the student dorms. Buried rooms, choked, sounds bricked off. 2 century thorns may break sudden bloom. What can we say? No one speaks of it. I dream pristine. And skirting the caution tape instead, we clasp hands with each other in complicity. Somewhere, the ghost arm of history still throttling me. Taste of old blood on the wind, the crouched statue of Sacagawea shrouded behind the pioneers. Creature of unbelonging, unname this new silence. Magnolia explosion, its leviathan shade. Then fall. What sick Messiah? Fall. I am coughing in the aisles again, where bare triage of voices pour molasses in my ear, where a bald insurrection of tongues, then squashed rebellion, scrutiny, indoctrination. To live here, we know precisely how to be hunted.
So very heavy and emotional poem. I just want to start by asking if anyone knows physically where this poem takes place, what she's referring to. You can just feel free to put it in the chat. Yes, somebody says UVA, that's correct. So this is referring to the lawn at the University of Virginia, where a few years ago it was found that the kind of infamous lawn where the rotunda is, that you see often on pictures of UVA, is actually built over top of what used to be quarters where enslaved people lived. And so there was an excavation that happened and some archaeology that was done, but that's now it's the lawn again, and so it obviously was a very jarring experience for the poet who was a student here at the time. So I want to ask just kind of what this poem makes you feel emotionally about the space. If you've never been to UVA, or even if you have, how does this poem create an emotional experience of being at the lawn? What are some words that come to mind? Haunted, yes, perfect. This is a very haunting poem for sure. Dark and grim. Yeah. Haunted, hunted, scared, aware and unaware. Hallowed ground, very lived experience. I love that feeling the past around you. Yeah, I'm hearing from a lot of people this. So there's this sense of these negative emotions of grim and death and difficulty, depression, and this feeling that I think Sinclair is able to create so well, of feeling history in the present and feeling the presence of history around them. Violence laden, yep, holding multiple realities. That's a great topic, apart and separate. So if you've ever been to the lawn or seen pictures of it, it's often celebrated as this very beautiful spot and very picturesque, but it's not picturesque for everyone. It's not beautiful or comfortable for everyone. And I think Sinclair does such a great job of painting this sort of alternative picture. It should be noted that the title of the poem, Notes on the State of Virginia, comes from Thomas Jefferson's writings, Notes on the State of Virginia. And so she titled some of her own poems as a way to kind of create this alternative experience and illustrate this alternative experience that she was having as a person of African descent on campus at UVA. Somebody put discovery, skirting the caution tape instead. Absolutely. So what I really like about teaching this poem is that it really illustrates how a place can feel so different to different people. I often talk about an experience that I had seeing a patient who was very uncomfortable in the physician's office. And actually, this was in residency, and the patient came in with their two daughters to be seen. The daughters had well child checks, and one of the male residents went in to see them, and the mother got very angry. Never met this male resident before. He introduced himself, and she got very angry and sort of activated and said, "Get out of here. You're not looking at my daughters. You're not touching my daughters. Leave the room now." And he was very taken aback and said, "Of course," and left the room and told us what had happened. And, we talked about this because to us, this was a very benign space. You're here at our clinic. Our clinic is nice. You're here for a checkup. This resident is very nice. What could have gone wrong? And we had to really step outside of ourselves and think this could be a very traumatic and triggering space for this mom. And we don't necessarily know why, or if it has to do with her experience or previous experience with her daughters, but we need to honor that and meet her where she is. And so we ended up switching and having a female resident go in and see the family instead. And so it was just a really important example of how the emotional experience that these poems can generate can actually be really helpful in sort of that imaginative practice of understanding what a patient may be going through, especially when it's something unexpected that's very different from your own reality. I think as healthcare providers, it's easy to take for granted the spaces where we work that can actually be very difficult places and very, very uncomfortable and dark places for our patients. This next poem, which we also have a recording of, is called ABC for Refugees, and it's by Monica Suck. So I'll play the poem now as well.
ABC for Refugees. Cherubi D, how does a man who doesn't read English well know that Cherubi Dum, those aren't really words, BD, but birds? Cherubi Dum, he stumbles, reading to me by the sliding glass door, Cheruby D, through which I watch my brother play in the dum-dum yard. Cheruby D, Cheruby dum, like how my father says, "Fine then, leave," my mother shouts, "Stupid, dumb." We live in a small BD nest too, one hallway to B-dum slam doors. Birds? What are birds? Thanks to my father reading with me, I have more feathers. THE, first word he ever taught me to pluck. It is a word used all the time. Cherub, cherub, be-dum. The mail, the mailbox, the school bus, the. He asks me to read the mail, not birds, mail. If you don't read this, you will turn into birds. And I read it to him the best I can. The end, a feather, two feathers, the end. Mother, mother, repeat after me. Cheruby dee, cheruby dum. We read together before bedtime.
So how does reading and hearing this poem make you feel? Just type in whatever you're feeling right now, just put it in the chat. Confused. That's definitely how I felt the first time I read this poem. Scattered, yes. Confused, lost, trying to connect to something on the edge of understanding, but kind of feeling outside of it. There's some joy in this poem. I think that's an important point too. There's a playfulness with the language. Definitely a sense of the different generations. You can tell the speaker is younger and then refers to their older parents. More confusion, absolutely. Yeah. So that's how I felt the first few times I read this poem. And I was really intrigued by that feeling of confusion. It made me want to go back and read it and listen to it again and again and try to figure out, like, what is happening here? What is with the cheruby dums, these words that seem to be made up? But there's something emotional happening here, especially when there's the shouting in the third stanza, find then leave. There's clearly a lot of emotional tension here that I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And I love how this person says, as if she were talking about two worlds and being able to play with language across different sounds. So what I really love is that I think what Monica Suck is trying to have us do is understand this experience of being a child who's a refugee and learning English with parents who do not speak English as a first language and are struggling in this poem to try to help their child learn how to read and read the mail and all of these kind of tasks of daily life that are very difficult when you don't speak English as a first language and really don't have that access to learn it very quickly. And so I think the brilliance of this poem is that Monica Suck is able to bring us for just a brief moment into that experience of confusion, of being stuck between two worlds, of constantly being slightly on the outside of something, and the emotional tension that results in what she calls the too small nest. And so I just love how she, within a few short stanzas, really creates a world for the reader to kind of just take a look into the life of the speaker. And I think this is really an important poem, especially for my trainees that are pediatricians or will be pediatricians, because we see so many children who are in this type of situation where they are kind of between two worlds and are having to navigate because they have more English than their parents do. And so it's important to understand the emotional impact of that for children and to recognize and put into place the supports and the services and resources necessary to support families that are in the situation. So I think that it's easy to say that, in a prosaic way, or to show you data on how many children of immigrants there are, how many parents don't speak English. But reading a poem about it by somebody who went through the experience, I think gives us a completely different education on this issue. And thanks for these other final comments. I have more feathers, reading. Yeah, it's almost like Monica Suck has created this internal language that straddles these two worlds, where birds are this metaphor that kind of continues throughout the poem. This final poem is, there's no recording, so I'll actually read it. It's by Tyree Day, who's a poem from Youngsville, North Carolina, a small town in central North Carolina. Ode to Small Towns. by Tyree Day. This where all the roadside memorials are, pink wreaths and dirty teddy bears. This where a man walked when he wanted to fly. This is where he lay down and later died. This where the train tracks folded the town in half. This where the man who died loved a woman. That's his heart you hear, not the train. This where I ran the dream-colored woods and did not know why. This where I believe a dog is buried. This where I danced in the long moonlight of a field. This where a woman planted ghost peppers. This where she thinned her blood with root water. This where you can see the whole town. This where the moon never goes. This where my grandmother hid some dreams. This where my dead may have met. This where they'll bury me. This where I shot a bird from smoke-smelling sky. This where it fluttered, fell. What's the effect of the repetition? You may notice that every single line pretty much starts with this where, and then there's the one where it says this is where. What does that affect for you as a reader or a listener? And what do you think Tyree Day is trying to say about small towns? It's kind of a song, incantation, a lament. Yes, it does make the poem feel very lyrical and musical. Absolutely, sounds repetitive. Yeah, and what does that repetition do? Why do poets use repetition? It draws you in. Yep, that's definitely one use of repetition. It kind of slows you down too, for sure. Brings us into connection. I love these comments. These are all true. Yes, brings you into the world of a poem. I've heard other readers talk about, yep, to bring you into their world, to place you. Somebody once said it sort of sounds like the speaker is giving somebody a tour, like you're walking through the town with them and they're pointing, saying, okay, here's the train tracks, and this where this guy died, and this where this person was there. It alerts when something is different. Yes. Yeah. So it is a way of creating a pattern, and then when something doesn't fit the pattern, it kind of jolts you out of that. Narrows the place where the poem is happening. Perfect. Yeah, it's a map to this person's world. What do you think that Tyree Day is trying to say about small towns? Is this an affectionate poem towards small towns, or sad, or something else? Lots of dead, hopelessness. You know, it's interesting because I taught this poem in a class recently with medical students in our literature and medicine course here for fourth year students. And we heard a lot of conflicting opinions. Most people said, this is sad because there's a lot of death. But then somebody said, well, only if you think that death is sad and death is part of life. And maybe it's that the speaker feels that this poem is their entire world. It contains life and death, and they know that they will be here for their whole life, and it's a place that is familiar to them. So yeah, it's home. I love how this person said it's home, with all the good and bad and complications and the life and death that is in that phrase. So it is complicated, like that complicated relationship with family, it runs deep. So I think that it can't be easily summed up. And I love that Tyree Day is able to say all of this in this short poem. It shows how, similar to the Sophia Sinclair poem, we might approach one space and have a certain set of assumptions about it, but somebody else can have a very different experience of that same space. So we don't have time for a full writing prompt, but I do want to encourage you to jot down some notes, take a screenshot, or come back to this webinar if you'd like, and try your hand at this if you want to as well. And so this writing prompt is to think about where you grew up, or anywhere where you lived in a formative time of your life. Think back to who lived there first, as far as you know. Could be who lived in the house where you live, or who lived on that land. Who were the first humans on that land, as far as you can find out. And how did you come to live there? And just think about your relationship to that land or that space, what it provided for you physically and emotionally and metaphorically. And then just try your hand at writing a poem about the abundance or lack that you experienced growing up there. You could try to use some of the techniques that we looked at today, such as repetition or creating beautiful or haunting scenery or imagery, or just trying to create an emotional experience for the reader. So I invite you all to do this on your own time. So what are some of the applications of using poetry and narrative medicine to teach health equity? So when I was a resident, I did what I would call pop-up poetry. I would print out poems randomly and just put them up around the hospital and places, our workstations and workrooms. And I was known when I was the senior resident to sometimes start off my rounds by reading a poem to the team or sending my team an email with, here's some articles, about the diseases our patients have this week. And oh, here's a poem that's relevant too that you should read. I even remember a quiet day once in the ICU where we were just sitting, kind of waiting. And I said to my colleagues, hey, do y'all want to hear a poem? And they said, sure. And I just read them this poem in the ICU and they closed their eyes and you could just see this sense of peace and comfort come over them for just a few moments. So I would love to do more of that kind of pop-up poetry and encourage others to do that as well. I'd like to expand those undergraduate offerings and hopefully teach bodies and books again, as well as to continue to revise and teach medical student electives, which we offer through our Center for Health Humanities and Ethics. And we are currently in the process of expanding and revising those electives to really incorporate the health equity lens. The challenge with graduate medical education, or GME, which is that kind of residency level and fellows level, is time. It's just really hard to pack something else into the curriculum for them. But my hope is that as we continue to prove and demonstrate the value of this, we can find creative ways to slip it in, either through pop-up poetry or a brief poem and a morning report or something like that. I think some of the other ways that we can grow this field is to increase academic diversity. So a lot of the things that I've been talking about are really electives that people opt into. They're not courses where everyone is asked to take it or required to take it. And so I think that can lead to a very self-selected group. And it would be really cool to have a larger group of people who have very different academic backgrounds and experiences to also take part in these electives and be able to offer their experiences and maybe get something else out of it. I think there's also really a huge potential for cross-campus partnerships. One example of this is that we've had a really cool writing workshop we've done a few times here at UVA, where we invite creative writing Master of Fine Arts students to sit in a room with medical students. And the medical students write poems about the body, and so do the MFA students, and they workshop these poems together. And so to have these two disciplines really hear the perspectives on these poems about the body has been a really fascinating experience. And then I would say we need to incorporate and include storytelling as part of our continuing medical education. This could take many forms, such as including the stories of patients and families who have been through certain experiences, as well as bringing what I would call professional storytellers or professional published poets and writers to actually give grand rounds. And one example of this is Javier Zamora. You can see here on the right, this is a poster that we made from a few years ago where we invited Javier Zamora, the critically acclaimed author of Unaccompanied, his poetry collection, and now his new nonfiction book out is called Solito, and it tells the story of his journey as an unaccompanied 9-year-old boy from El Salvador to the US. And he came and spoke to us, and he gave grand rounds, and then he also did some really cool community lectures and spoke to young people here in Charlottesville who had nothing to do with the university through a partnership with a local arts organization called the Bridge Progressive Arts. And so we were able to bring Javier here to do not only a talk to the physicians and the medical people, but also in the community. And that was a way for us to do more community collaboration as well, and to kind of share the wealth of these experiences of these poets and writers. There's also really, I think, an opportunity for journal clubs that are transdisciplinary. So we think about journal clubs as stereotypically somebody bringing a journal article that's about a medical issue or a new research study, and you talk about it as a group. And I think there's a lot of different materials we could talk about in a journal club. We could discuss a short story or a poem or a patient essay or narrative. We could have journal clubs about podcasts or films. And I think that really the limitations are non-existent. It's really endless what we could do. And so this example is an article I wrote last year about one of Javier Zamora's poems called Doctor's Office First Week in This Country, which is an incredible poem I really love, but especially as a pediatrician, I think it teaches us so many important lessons about some of the experiences that our patients who may be immigrants to the US may go through when they come to their first doctor's appointment, and really teaching students to approach a poem from a literary criticism standpoint can, I think, truly help them to become better, more sensitive, more empathic doctors who have a better sense of what their patients may actually be going through. So we're running short on time here, so I just wanted to share with you all a couple of quick poems of my own and then open it up to questions. This poem is called The Forest Fire of Family Trees, and it will be in my forthcoming collection, Milk Tongue, which comes out in May. The Forest Fire of Family Trees. The problem is, we don't know that many ways of doing things. For instance, neither of us can fry an egg without public radio chattering in our ears. And there are worse blueprints for a home, like what my grandfather taught my uncle. We think we know people until we see the way they eat a banana, totally unlike how we peel and devour the fruit. Only instead of eating a banana, it's something way bigger, like loving another person. As the snowflakes get thicker, I hear myself say exactly what my mother would say when faced with the same situation, and I say it in her voice. It's not that I'm ashamed to share all my DNA and most of my life with these two people, it's just that I worry. It's not easy to recognize the odor of toxins you release day after day, which when rearranged spells door. You cross the threshold and think it's just the cologne of the world, not the smoke in your blood, not grass burning from the little fires ignited by your feet. And this next poem is also going to be in Milk Tongue. Never have I ever. Mother's Day, I'm at work, where the hospital ward is thick with babies. I enter room after room to look into their eyes, long-awaited or unexpected guests. The babies stare at me, solemn and decisive. The next links in a chain of desire older than any of us can imagine. Later that day, I order a hands-free breast pump, giddy with the thought of making myself into food. I love land so much I become it. I want more so badly, I'll make it from my own body. Behind the final door, an operating room, parents beaming under heat lamps. The abundance of twins, my own baby swelling against my scrubs as I congratulate them. Never have I ever wanted so much, eating ice cream at any hour, crying over the chorus of spring peepers dopplering through the passenger window, my whole body a horde of 17-year cicadas wrestling their way up from the dirt. I said I wouldn't want so much the wiser I got, but earth, forgive me. I got drunk on thick-knotted blackberry rising from the humid flank of this land, breathed a dream of ancient honeysuckle and crabapple, woke in a wetland clutching cattail and throating a swallow's nesting song. This is the day my mother has made. Today I walk into room after room. I tell the babies, never have I ever known a way to be that wasn't velvety white on the tongue, sweet salt and fat, letters curdled in the mouth, rising from amniotic foam at the moment of the first shout. So in conclusion, narrative medicine can foster cultural consciousness and structural competency. I think that poetry is especially applicable to this field of critical medical humanities, which is emerging. And I think that transdisciplinary medical education can really help us, again, fulfill Flexner's recommendations, which were to not only increase the amount of the quote unquote hard sciences that we include in medical education, but also that element of culture and society that all healthcare providers need to know. Here are my references, and I will take questions.
Okay, one question's come in. How do you find readings to assign? What are your criteria for inclusion?
That's a great question. It depends on the course. We have several different courses. Basically, I try to pick readings that will address some topic or theme. So, for example, for Bodies in Books, we had structured each class around a theme. So one theme was about rurality, for instance, And we picked readings that really spoke to the theme of virality and social determinants of health that have to do with living in a remote or rural area. There are countless poems, books, short stories, films, podcasts. There is too much almost of potential readings that could be included. And we can only pick 3 or 4 to not overwhelm students. So much of this is based on my own reading and when I collaborate with colleagues, with my colleagues' readings and the readings that we're most familiar with and feel comfortable teaching. But one thing that we try to do in our courses is ensure that there's a diversity of voices represented and diversity in all senses in terms of abilities, race, ethnicity, backgrounds, places where people are from, whether rural or urban, sexualities and gender orientations, et cetera. And so that's really the intention behind the way we craft the course. But we recognize that there's no way we can comprehensively include every single experience. But the idea is really to use these readings as tools to teach students how to take this analytical practice of close reading and reflective writing and apply it to any type of narrative they may come across in the future.
We do have another question. Were you always so creative wanting to write as a child?
Yes, I was. I started writing before I could physically write. I would tell my mom things and have her write them down in a journal for me when I was like 3. I always loved storytelling and knew that I would be a writer. And it's always been a really important part of my life. I actually grew up without a television, which in the 90s was like really the only screen there was, unlike today. So I also didn't have a lot of other distractions that unfortunately many kids have today to sort of stifle that creativity. So I spent a lot of time outside, a lot of time immersed in books and writing. And it's something that I realized really fed my soul and made me feel like a whole and well person. And so I really clung to that in medical education as a way to keep the other side of my brain going and to keep myself just feeling like me.
Do you ever ask your patients to write?
I sometimes do, and I don't necessarily ask to read what they've written, and I don't usually give them a specific prompt, but especially with my older patients, my teenagers, I will often ask if they enjoy writing, and if they do, I offer that journaling or potentially writing specific poems or letters or things as a therapeutic approach. I never ask to read their work because certainly they're welcome to share it, but I want this writing to be a space for them where they can write their most vulnerable and private emotions and thoughts, which can be really helpful for some children. I also try to make sure that when I ask questions like that, I'm very open-ended because I recognize some people don't enjoy writing and reading or don't feel like they're good at it or comfortable with it. And I always try to assess, especially for kids that are dealing with psychological difficulties, what are the outlets? Maybe it's listening to music or making music. Maybe it's drawing or painting. Maybe there's something else, but there may be some potential for some creative therapy for a lot of people. So I do try to bring that up.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions? Yeah, comments? Wonderful presentation. Have you encountered any skepticism within medicine about this approach?
That's a good question. I'm hesitating because I don't think anybody that I know personally would actually say that to my face. So I haven't really had people come to me and personally say, I think this is not relevant or not useful. I know that generally in medicine, I do feel like there's a culture of skepticism and that there's a sense of hierarchy that, that narrative medicine stuff is fine, but it's really more important that everyone learn their anatomy and their physiology. And I take issue with that in the sense that I don't think it should be a hierarchy. Unfortunately, we can't teach everyone every single thing. And the more that we learn about medicine and science and the more our body of knowledge expands, the more it becomes clear that that's not all going to fit into 4 years. So what I've seen is that a lot of medical schools are moving towards curricula that are more elective based and allow students to learn kind of a set of basics in 1 or 1.5 years, then move on to a clinical year, and then have a lot of extra time to do more in-depth electives, whether those are a more in-depth anatomy class for somebody who wants to go into surgery, for example, or to do a health humanities or narrative medicine course. And so I think that may be one kind of answer to that. It still doesn't address the issue of self-selection bias that I had talked about earlier. And I think that everyone should be exposed a little bit to some of these narrative practices, even if they aren't intending to write professionally or read novels in their spare time. But I think that just understanding how a story is structured, how to read between the lines, is really helpful in learning how to listen to patients. So there is certainly broader skepticism in the culture of medical education, but I also think that medical education is moving in a direction that will allow for a little bit more creative and sort of outside the box courses like these to be fit in for more people.
Okay, and there were a couple of comments. The body and mind and spirit are not separate.
Absolutely.
And some health humanities focus include increasing empathy on the physician's part.
Yes, I totally agree with both of those. I think that one sort of natural outcome of these narrative practices is an increase in empathy, and not simply because you read people's stories and then you understand people can go through difficult experiences or experiences different from your own, but that it really develops that, like I said, that close listening that allows you to hear people that you, in a busy clinical encounter, it may be easy to just sort of gloss over what somebody is saying, or to just say, not really listen just so you can check your boxes in your chart and make sure you've got all of the information you need from the patient. But I think training physicians to have this practice of close listening can actually train them to tap into their empathy more when they're actually in clinical encounters. And I think sorry, I was just gonna say, I think it gives you also an appreciation for language and the diversity of the ways that people express themselves, because I find it truly delightful how my patients will tell their stories, and not just because many of them are children, but their parents as well. People just have so many different ways of expressing things, and when you have an appreciation for language, it's really fun to see that and to kind of approach people's stories from a place of enjoyment too. Like, I'm here to listen and to really appreciate your story, not just as a physician, but as a human being who's listening to what you have to say.
Well, thank you for that. And there are a couple of comments that say listening is so important, although in a very short doctor visit, it is hard. And someone else put in the chat that listen to the patient and they will tell you the diagnosis. Osler.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately the way medicine is structured in the current day and age is a very corporate medical model where time is money, and we don't always have the time that we would like to listen to our patients, but listening is also a skill. And I think there are things that we as physicians can learn to do to kind of bring out that story, and even in a small amount of time, to make sure that we are creating a space for patients where they are heard and they do feel listened to, and that we are actively listening. And I'm not going to say that I always do that perfectly, because it's really hard to do, but it's something that I actively think about and work on. And I do think that narrative medicine does help me in the moment in those situations.
And we have one more comment. I was a librarian with Rita Sharon 30 years ago. You are a successor, one of the seeds she planted.
Oh, thank you. Yes, she is fantastic.
All right, if there are no other questions, I'm going to share my screen really quick. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew, for your time and for that fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
All right, I just want to just give a shout out now, really quick. We have a couple of webinars coming up in Region 1. One is about teaching BIPOC youth about farming, food, and health through culturally reflective library resources. And it was a funded project. And the other one is dignity and personal care, addressing hygiene insecurity. And you can sign up for those at nnlm.gov/training. And thank you so much. I did put a link to the evaluation in the chat. I'll put it in there again. And everyone have a great afternoon. And thank you so much again, Dr. Mathieu. And thank you everyone for coming. Have a good evening.